Hello. Today, as part of What's That About special election coverage, we're excited to have Representative Marjorie Decker, the Democratic State Rep in Massachusetts' 25th Middlesex and Chair of the Joint Committee on Public Health. Previous interviews of Berman Tabacco and Evan Mackay are already up on the website, and more are coming this week. So thanks for coming on our show, Marjorie.
Sure.
To most of us who follow Cambridge politics, you're a familiar face, first as city council and state rep. But can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you first decide to run for public office?
Yeah, well, Pete, let me just say I appreciate you having me here. I know that you've talked quite a bit about me over the years, and I just appreciate the opportunity to actually be able to respond to any questions that you have in person for the first time. So Thank you for that. I grew up here in Cambridge. I ran for city council, honestly, because I felt like there's too many families like mine who grew up in public housing, first generation to graduate from high school as I was. And even in a community like ours, where people would talk a lot about sort of the things that they thought families like mine needed, we weren't often at the table as a part of that discussion. And so I ran because I thought it was really important for people to have lived experience, particularly when it comes to issues around poverty, to be part of those conversations. And that's what launched me to run for city council. And it's the same commitment that I have continued to carry as a state representative. I work really hard to bring voices of people who aren't often centered in government. So whether that's tackling how do we reduce poverty in Massachusetts, or I'm sure you're aware of the landmark legislation that I was able to help author last session on maternal health that really focused on racial equity. And that was after chairing a commission for 2 years with 28 people, where 27 of them were women of color, and listening to families across the state talk about how, regardless of their income, their profession, their education, their zip code, that when it came to maternal health, too many families of color were still struggling to get the care they need, the access they need, and most importantly, to be believed in their birthing experiences. So to have been able to take that legislation and make sure that we didn't just leave it as a commission, as a report, which too often honestly happens, but to take that and turn that into what has been recognized as national landmark legislation, so that it was a bill that was informed by birthing people of color, by women of color, by dads, and know that we're going to save lives. I think that's the same energy that I've brought to a number of issues. This year, as you probably know, I held a town hall right after I was elected last term, and I brought the ACLU with me, and Fenway Health, and MIRA, which is an organization that focuses on supporting immigrants in Massachusetts and refugees. So we held a town hall at Baldwin and really talked about, now that Trump was elected, we knew that 2020, many of us believed 2025 was real, Project 2025. We believed that the president and all of their, his hateful, I guess, supporters were serious about challenging democracy and challenging and assaulting our healthcare and our civil rights. So I had the town hall, brought those folks together with folks in Cambridge and said, what should we be focusing on? And two of the things became really clear was, one, that they were really going to go after immigrants in our community, which they certainly have, as well as attack the ability for the LGBTQ community to access healthcare. So in working with folks like Fenway Health, Trans Health, and all of the community health centers and the hospitals across the state, I invited a lot of the hospitals to come into the legislature with advocates who are working with the LGBTQ community to say, what would it look like to preserve, assuming that Project 2025 is real and it's going to go forward, what would it look like to ensure that members of the LGBTQ community could access healthcare? And based on that, and bringing people with lived experience into the conversation, I was able to develop legislation that is now, we were the first in the state to create legislation that provides the legal framework, which is a public health trust, along with over $6 million to ensure that all of our LGBTQ community, but especially our kids who are transgender, are able to access care outside of the hospitals as the Trump administration started attacking both providers and families, going after records, and probably most importantly, threatening to pull back funding streams. Mm-hmm. So my lived experience has been one in which I know what it feels like to be left out of the conversation but talked about. And then that would be the same for the legislation we did this year in protecting immigrants in Massachusetts. I was so proud to stand with my colleagues in the Black and Latino caucus, and honored that I was one of 4 non-members of the caucus who was asked to stand with them at the press conference and at the bill filing because of one of my bills that I had been working with them on that was included. And what we did was pass nationally one of the strongest bills in the country that protects immigrants. It allows us to hold ICE civilly and legally responsible. It prevents ICE from going into courthouses, which was the bill that I had been filing. It also prevents the RMV and courts from sharing data, gives money to organizations that are helping with legal support for immigrants.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're talking about the PROTECT Act here.
Yeah,
right?
talking about the PROTECT Act, and also expands that. Something I fought really hard for was to expand that protection from ICE in sensitive spaces like our schools, our hospitals, our houses of faith. And so my lived experience is why I ran for office, and it's been my North Star when it comes to making sure, who are we centering in these policies? Who's not at the table, and building relationships extensively across not only our community, but across the Commonwealth to make sure that they are there while we're shaping the legislation and not an afterthought.
Okay, and I appreciate that thoughtful answer. And since you talked about the PROTECT Act, why don't we get into that a little bit?
That'd be great.
I know you're a big advocate for it.
Yeah.
And I appreciate what it does. I guess my question is, and this goes back to an issue that I've talked about about Beacon Hill, is like the lack of a sense of urgency. I know you started holding hearings right after the election, as you said, but why did it take a year and a half for something like this, a year and a half into Trump's second term, when we knew it was coming? You knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Why did it
That's
take
a great
so long
question,
to happen?
Pete. So it's a great question. I think it's more important to understand that members of the Black and Latino caucus, which have become greater in number because of we passed legislation to actually change the voting maps to ensure that we had more voices from communities of color and hopefully more immigrants, which is what has happened. So the caucus spent 1 year. And maybe you could invite some of them onto your show. I'd be happy to make an introduction. But they spent 1 year going around the state and trying to make sure that they really understood what could Massachusetts do as a state to in fact provide what would protection and public safety laws look like, what do immigrants across the state need, and they worked with groups like the Brazilian Workers Center, La Colaborativa in Chelsea, and so they held hearings across the state while also juggling the needs of their own constituents, their own communities. Many of my colleagues from the Black and Latino caucus also represent, as you probably know, what are called gateway communities, which are communities that have high needs because they're under-resourced because of anti-Blackness and systemic racism. And so this was really an opportunity for them to hear and meet with experts, legal experts, healthcare experts, educational experts, and to really craft legislation. I mean, it's not as obvious as you think. The federal government is, they have a lot of power, as we've seen, and they abuse power, and they don't recognize the rule of law. And so they spent a year really crafting that bill. But what is remarkable for a place that sometimes does take way too long and doesn't always seem to act with urgency, that they spent a year engaging communities across the state. And as soon as that legislation was filed, it was within months that we actually adopted it. So I would say that example is a great example of what it looks like when we're actually meeting the moment with urgency. And I know that my opponent, somebody who I know you've publicly supported over the years, so I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show because I know that you're not exactly neutral, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to have some equal time on your show. But, my opponent has talked about how they alone would come in and have voted against the bill, which is remarkable given that the bill was shaped by communities across Massachusetts who are on the ground working with immigrants, and many who are immigrants and undocumented themselves. And I think it's important to educate people about this one piece in which my opponent doesn't talk about the important parts of the bill. They just say that they alone would come in and fight. And I think for me, the difference is I given my lived experience of knowing what it's like to have people talk a lot about solutions for my family, but not invite me to be part of that conversation, I think I would invite my colleague to actually just, the person running against me, to take a pause and really sort of do more listening and understand that the one piece that they talk about, like we're the only blue state with the 287G agreement. I want you to know that that was not an easy decision that was made by my colleagues and supported by many of us in the legislature. It was not an easy decision by people who are on the ground working with immigrants who are being detained and whose families are being wrecked and split up and ripped apart. But it was a harm reduction decision. So I want to take this chance, since you've raised the issue. There's this one agreement that is left. So it is almost impossible for ICE, for Massachusetts, to have any new 287G agreements, which, for those who are listening, it's this agreement with essentially the federal government. We left one in place after lots and lots of conversations, which is part of the time, is why they took a year to develop this bill. This is complicated stuff. And the decision that they had to make was, what would be the harm reduction decision in allowing, so if somebody commits a crime, they serve time. Yep. And the federal government is notified, whether it's Obama, Biden, Trump, whoever it is, that somebody whose immigration status is still like in process has served time for a crime that they committed. So the decision had to be whether or not to inform them that they were being released from the Department of Corrections on such a day in such a facility, or allow them, like on their monthly report, to know that, so many people have actually served their time and have gone back into the community, and allow ICE to go into communities like Chelsea or Bedford, not only exposing everybody in that community potentially to be collateral damage, but then going into a home in which they were looking for somebody in which there's probably a high chance of a mixed status family. So this was not an easy decision. And if it were up to ICE, up to all of us, we would eliminate ICE from actually ever entering our state. As you know, rule of law has not been recognized by ICE, and we cannot prevent them from coming in. So it was a harm reduction decision that said, better to inform them so that they could choose, if they should want to come to the facility on the day that someone's being released. They don't necessarily do that, but eventually they do come looking for people, as opposed to the collateral damage and wreaking havoc on people in their neighborhoods and in their homes. But I would say that once the caucus filed that bill, after a lot of due diligence and a lot of really centering people whose experiences we're trying to honor and protect, the bill actually went through pretty quickly.
Okay, I hear you, but you can understand, I mean, from the outside, a year and a half seems like a long time when people are being abducted off the streets. And
yeah, I actually don't think that for those who are, if we're talking about the people who are being abducted, right? I don't think that's you, Pete, and it's not me, right? But if we're talking to the communities that are actually being impacted, I would really encourage you, and I'd be really happy to facilitate this. You should have them come on your show. I think it's really easy to stand here and sort of make a political grandstanding statement about it took too long, when in fact, what is happening in this country is an assault on immigrants. It's an assault on our civil rights. It's an assault on our very existence, right? And so that they spent a year thinking that's the time that they needed to talk to people with lived experience and walk through. I mean, I'll tell you, for me, it took me 9 months to establish the language for creating the public health trust to provide gender affirming care outside of the hospitals. I mean, maybe you think that was too long, but I'll tell you it's complicated, because we had hospital CEOs, community health centers, and LGBTQ advocacy groups who I brought together over a period of 9 months. And we had to work through a lot of legal issues. I mean, if it were that fast, we would have done it. But we're in really ugly times, and I think that, we're all doing what we can to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and able to create this firewall that also can hold up to the assaults in which they're using the courts to try to tear this down.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Let's get back to some of the political situation right now. In the last election, you faced an extremely tight race, winning by 42 votes.
41, actually. You keep giving me an extra vote. Thank you, but it's 41.
41, okay. What What do you take from that experience? Did you make any changes in your approach to the office or how you communicate with your constituents? Did you feel like, was there a message or, yeah?
Yeah, well, I'd say a few things. First of all, I kept working on the things that were important to our community, right? I never took that as a message that people didn't care about the anti-poverty work that I do. So I was able to keep working on legislation that tries to put more cash in people's pockets. Last session, while my opponent spread lies and said that I passed a tax bill for millionaires, and I didn't acknowledge that, or I didn't correct it, I should say. What we actually did was pass a tax bill that the governor had filed that reduced the short-term capital gains from 12 to 5%. And I fought to actually not have it go down to 5%, but I was able to be part of a group of us that got it to 8%. And in that bill, I was able to increase my fourth earned income tax credit. When I started, the earned income tax credit was at 15%, one of the lowest in the states for such a progressive state, right? We weren't doing everything we could to help our families who are working and still having to experience hunger and choices between medication and food. So in that bill, I was able to get my fourth increase. So it's up to 40% now. I was also able to increase the family tax credit, which hadn't been done in over a decade, as well as increase it so that every child in the family would now get a tax credit. We did it so only your first couple of children would get tax credits. So I would say some of the things that I did differently are in the last 2 years is I kept working on how do I make sure that our families who are struggling the most are getting more support. And I chaired a commission on how to reduce poverty, held hearings around the state, and made sure to hold a hearing right here in Cambridge. So we had people with lived experience come and inform that bill. I filed that legislation, and we're still working on it. But I think in addition to that, in addition to holding the town hall afterwards and creating the nation's first gender-affirming care trust outside of the hospitals, I think the thing that I learned is that when people put things out there about you that are untrue and you let them sit there, they become fact for some people. So I think I've been really diligent at just both responding to things that are untrue, responding to my opponent who has really worked hard to confuse people about where I stand. Let's talk about transparency, because I know that's an issue that you care deeply about.
Yep.
And I'm so happy that we actually share that commitment, because I think that when government's not honest about what they're doing, the people that I fight the hardest for are the people who have the most to lose. So for me, transparency has always been a core tenet of what we should expect. It's like the minimum of what we should expect from our elected officials, because I know that the stakes are high for those who have the least. So I think, 2 years ago, my opponent said that the committee votes weren't public. Well, we ignored that, but they were public. They just weren't accessible. So I campaigned 2 years ago and said, if I'm elected again, I will work to not only make sure that those committee votes are public, but that they're more accessible. And so one of the things I was able to do in this last round of rules reform was to get those committee votes and all of our testimony online. So it's actually much more accessible. And I will just also say that I wish 2 years ago I had shared with people that prior to this even being an election issue, my committee votes were public. And I have now since been able to pull up news articles in which, when the press has asked me, what are your committee votes as a chair, I've given them, even when my counter chair in the Senate hasn't given them. So I think the most important thing for me is that when disinformation and misinformation and is put out there, we're in a time in which Trump has made it really clear, right? It's like facts don't matter, fake news, lie, do whatever to get what you want. I recognized over the last 2 years that I needed to spend time, and I took it for granted. And that really is a mistake that I will never make. I assumed that people knew about my record. I assumed that when somebody said, I voted against same-day voter registration, they would know that it just doesn't align with who I am. So not only did I not vote against same-day voter registration, I was part of the fight along with MassPerg, the ACLU, Mass Votes, the NAACP. And so now we're actually showing people that, it's trying to distort my record is not good for democracy. But but just as importantly, I've learned it's not good for me. And so, so that's what I would say I've done different, is really make sure. I've always communicated, as you know, because I think you're on my email list.
Yep.
I'm one of the few legislators, even here in Cambridge, that does an email every week. During the pandemic, I did it 7 days a week because I knew it was really important that people needed information. They needed accurate information. I reduced it after 9 months to 5 days a week. I held 22 local cable shows, which I had never done. You're the expert. I just had to start learning on the fly. And we've continued to do that, right? So it's being available, being accessible, being in the community, but holding, I'd say, disinformation and lies accountable and making sure that I bring the truth forward.
Let's stick on committee votes, and I know obviously we lobbied you for making committee votes public, and you
didn't have to lobby me because I'd already been doing it before you lobbied me. Which is what the 2020 article shows.
Well, so you voted against making committee votes public several times, including in 2021 when you spoke. You spoke on the record, and it's recorded, saying you did not support. There were several situations where you don't support making committee votes public, and I believe up to 2023, it was not a roll call vote, but the Erica Oterhoven's bill was voted down by a voice vote. My question is, what did you change? I understand that you have always said that your votes are public, and you always say how you vote committee.
They are,
but it's a institutional problem, right? It's important that each committee vote is public, but if you're just doing it and it's not the law, it's not the regulation, that doesn't help most of us. So my question is, what changed your mind about making committee votes public for everyone?
Yeah, I don't think it was about changing my mind. I think what I was doing is, once again, being transparent with you, Pete, and others. Mm-hmm. I talked about a time in which, first of all, I've made my committee votes public whenever they were asked. So I think that that's something that's really important to note. And I know that it seems to be more of a footnote than a highlight, but, and I have press clippings that have showed that. I also, at the beginning of every committee hearings and sessions that I've chaired, and I've been a chair for now 8 years, I've said, testimony is not public. Testimony is not private. It's public. The only time I held testimony private is if it was an individual, because I chaired the Committee on Mental Health, Substance Use and Recovery, and Public Health, if it was a private, personal story of somebody in which we're holding sensitive information. But to nobody else, it was a public. I gave you the story of where in these committees that there were times in which we did a poll. So as you know, I filed legislation which was talked about as the red flag bill. This is a bill that eventually did pass, and it said that if you or your loved one in your home had a gun, and I filed it both as a suicide prevention bill as well as a public safety bill, and that if you thought someone was going to use their gun against themselves or someone else, my bill would allow you to call a number in the similar way that you would do a restraining order. Before, you would have to call the police chief or the police commissioner, and they alone would decide whether or not your guns should be taken. My bill now allows people to call a number to get an extreme risk protection order, and within hours, there's a judge who decides whether or not you're a danger to others. Yep. When I was trying to get that bill through, this was right after the massacre at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Mm-hmm. And another bill similar to mine had been sent to study, but mine was still in play. That bill, that committee vote had a lot of conservative Dems on it, and including the chair at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we call it a poll. So we were trying to get it to the floor so that we could then have a public conversation and a public vote on that bill. And unlike the Senate that took a voice vote, the House actually took a public vote on that. So what I said to you was very transparent, is that I understood why there might be reasons why we want to have a poll that was not always public. That two truths exist, is that I understood that, but that I personally always made my votes and my committee votes public. And then from hearing from constituents, we changed it 4 years ago before my opponent ran. So that had already changed even before you lobbied. But then I also got on board and said, to this past session, I'm the one that fought to make them more accessible. They're online because I pushed our leadership to do that. So when you talk about what's evolved, is that I heard that my reasoning for thinking why my experience with the red flag bill might not be enough reason for other committees to also not always be public, I fought for it. So I responded and I listened, which is, I think, what we want elected officials to do.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope we have time for a couple more questions on some policies, but I did want to ask you about this. You've been asked about your employment with Berman Tobacco.
Yeah.
The last debate, and Harvard Crimson just posted an article on, I think, July 31st. Why do you think this continues to be an issue? And what would you say to voters concerned about your outside responsibilities and how it might impact your job as their representative?
Yeah, I would say to voters, first of all, I have to have a second job like many people in this community to afford to live here. It has never been a secret that I have a second job. You do know that I've had to file a disclosure from the moment that I've had this job. And my disclosure is probably one of the most transparent disclosures, which was written by my attorney, who is a national attorney on ethics law. So we should start there. It's become an issue because my opponent and others maybe who support my opponent have made it seem like that I was hiding something when I never was hiding anything. And I think that's right there a disservice not only to me, but it's a disservice to democracy to distort the truth. My disclosures have always been there. My opponent has gone out and saying that I don't talk about my job. I do talk about my job. My community who's interacted with me talk about my job. I'm very proud that my law firm goes after bad corporate actors and holds them accountable. It's very linear to the work I do as a state representative. And now that's all public information. What I would ask you, Pete, what I find interesting is I've had people who are like, but you work a second job. And I have to. I don't, unlike my opponent, I don't come from family wealth, right? I don't get to live at Harvard where I've never had to pay a utility bill in 12 years or buy my own toilet paper, right? I have kids. I have an aging mom who lives in public housing. But I'd say more importantly, the ability to try to live in Cambridge and afford to live here, for many of us, it's a choice. And we have to work hard to actually keep that choice. So those are choices that my opponent has never had to have. But you know that there's also legislators in Cambridge who have second jobs and who've never been asked about it. Even their own supporters have talked about my job, but have never asked them about their job. And I would say people have the right to know what I do, which is why I fulfill the law, which is why I have a disclosure, right? So also, I think it's important to note that I have been recognized by the Vanderbilt University Center for Public Efficacy. I forget the term of it, but Vanderbilt University did a study, and I am shown in the top 4%, one of the most effective legislators that they studied over a period of 8 years. Now, I didn't need Vanderbilt University to tell me that, but I think people in our community know I wake up every day living and breathing that I have the opportunity to figure out how to make people's lives better. And I have been prolific at never taking this job for granted.
Oh.
My computer died. Sorry about that.
Sorry, yeah.
The Center for Effective Policymaking talked about me being one of the most effective legislators, and that has been shown through my record, right? So this idea that my second job is an issue, it's only an issue for somebody who's struggling to figure out how to run against my record and then has done what they've done throughout the last 3 years, right? Told very little about themselves and actually I don't know. I mean, I'm disclosed about what I do. I'm proud of the job that I do. And I haven't missed a beat in working really hard and waking up every day and figuring out how do I make people's lives better? Because that's our job in government, right? Is to not only talk about it, but to have a strategy, to build relationships. And that's what I've done.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, but I mean, it's not.
And I'm just going to say this, Pete, I think it's really something that the person who comes from extraordinary wealth, right? Extraordinary wealth, who's been living in the undergraduate dorms at Harvard for 12 years and who has a fourth degree that they haven't started yet, right? Who doesn't pay utility bills, who doesn't have to actually know the cost of eggs or buy toilet paper, is weaponizing the fact that I have a second job, even though I meet every criteria that I have to make sure that there's no conflict of interest and that I'm actually meeting all the disclosures. Yet no other man in this area who holds a second job has been asked about that. And I'm living the life that most people in our community live. And
I
that's
would,
struggling to work to figure out, when you don't come from wealth, how do you still manage to stay in the city of Cambridge? And yet I'm still seen as one of the most effective legislators based on my record, not my opinion.
yeah, I would push back a little bit on that in that
Well, of course you would, Pete. You've been supporting Evan for 3 years. I expect
I
that.
have, well, that's a different story.
And prior to that, I mean, you've never reached out to have coffee with me, Pete. I've never reached out to you. Oh, we did. I finally
We
reached
did.
out
We
to you
had
to have
coffee.
coffee.
Um, the question, just real quick about the second job, and this is a job. I mean, my opponent, your opponent, sorry, did not.
I mean, you can join my team. You can both be
Yeah.
our opponents. I'd love to have your support.
I mean, the Cambridge Day was the one who asked the question. The Crimson is
No, the
one
Cambridge
who-
Day. Let's start right there. The Crimson, which has literally been an extension of the McKay campaign. Let's go back 2 years ago, Pete. We want to go down this, right? Evan ran their campaign, fundraising campaign,
Yeah.
illegally out of the Harvard dorms. Their Act Blue address is Harvard dorms. They continue to use their Harvard dorms for their campaign address, and they ran campaign activities that they posted out of Harvard classrooms, right? They had somebody on paid staff for Evan who was also on the Crimson team. And while we asked this year, do we get like a profile piece like Evan did? They said, hey, you get it when you do your kickoff. We never got that.
Okay.
When they put out that Evan had X number of endorsements and put down that I had 0, and then we gave them at the time over the 40 endorsements we now have over 50. It took them days to correct the record. Their own writer said, I don't understand why my editor's not changing this. And if you, Pete, I know that this is like your field, go do your own analysis. We've had professional analysis look at the unconscious, we'll call it unconscious bias of the Crimson report. The Crimson's been an extension of the McKay campaign. And so, and I would say, let's talk about the Cambridge Day. The coverage of the Cambridge Day this year has been very different under the professional guidance of new ownership team and a new editor than the other editor, in which I never spoke to that editor, never engaged with that newspaper based on behaviors that were unsafe to people who I had to support. So I would just say, Pete, like to be using the Cambridge Day and the Cambridge Crimson as an example from last election is
well, this is an interesting point. I mean, do you feel like the Cambridge Day has been biased against you this
2 years ago? No, not now. Now that they have a professional editor, no. I don't need a newspaper to be my press secretary, but I do need an editor to actually have ethical guardrails and present objectively. And the Harvard Crimson, while they did a second issue on keep writing about my second job, right? There's nothing, I'm proud of that job. But what's interesting is that they were originally doing that story as a recap of the debate and told us, we have the email saying that, oh, this is a recap. It's a lone story. They never did the recap. They printed the story in print on the front page and only put it online after the print came out, right? I mean, the Crimson has been an extension of their friend and their peer. I get it. But no, I would say both the Globe and the Cambridge Day this year, you will see the Globe stopped using me as a punching bag for the speaker and is focused on where they should be the speaker. And the Cambridge Day has actually had, professional journalists leading and owning. So it's been great.
Yeah.
I got to go, Pete.
Okay.
I've given you, I told you I had 30 minutes. We've had 40. So
Okay.
I've got to go pick up my kid right now.
Okay. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more, but if you don't have time, I totally appreciate it. Totally
No, I appreciate this time. This has been great. And again, as I know you have never wanted to have a real conversation prior to my asking you for coffee about my position. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I don't know if it's because you had to offer us equal time, but whatever it is, I'm thrilled. I had coffee with you last time. I'm always happy to meet with you. I actually think there's a lot more that you and I agree on than don't agree. And I think, and I'm going to say this, Pete, I think that this is why it's really important, right? How you campaign is how you govern. I've had an opponent who has said a lot of things that are not true, that have been not fact-based, and have not been about my record of my actual record. Because as my opponent has said, they agree with so many things that I do. I'm one of 200 people. I'm one of 160 in the House. I am the disruptor at the House that actually pushes them to do things that they don't want to do, because the majority of the people I serve with come from communities that had a higher voter turnout for Trump in this election than last election. So I work really hard to both be the disruptor, to be the North Star, but also to do what I'm supposed to do. And that's to make government actually respond to the needs of people in our community. And that's just my record. No matter how much Evan wants to twist that and distort it, that's the truth. And so I understand why coming after sort of all these other sort of, creating innuendo and exaggerating and misleading people, but it's not good for democracy, because somebody like you, having sat with you, I think actually has a lot more in common about the work that I do. And I am clearly the better candidate who has the experience to actually keep getting us there. If these are the things that we care about the assault on our civil liberties, the assault on our health care, the assault on our civil rights, the assault on immigrants, the assault on women, right? I am the legislator. And this is objective. This isn't just me. This is my record. And it's why mass equality, Bay State Stonewall Dams, Clean Water Action, Environmental League of Massachusetts, Planned Parenthood, and all the labor groups, including Evan's own labor group, the Greater Boston Labor Council, have come out to support me, because they know that I'm up there and that I am working hard to make sure that our state is meeting the moment that we're in a body that is too slow and doesn't actually have the same amount of urgency that I have, or that I think that you have. So I thank you for this, and I'd be happy to come on anytime. We got 2 weeks to go.
Right.
I'm working hard. I'm asking people who are watching this, if you like my work, if you care about the things that I care about, send me back with your vote on or before September 1st. And Pete, I hope you and I can grab coffee again. Hopefully Simons will still be there after the election. But let's go there and meet.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to come on. And yes, remember to vote on September 1st or before. Not an ideal day for a lot of people in Cambridge, but
terrible day.
Get out there and vote. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, let's talk more later.
All right. Take care, Pete.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.